soon. We've got a lot of people, and I think we're ready to go.
Sounds good. All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining this webinar. I know it's been a long time coming. You've had lots of questions about program performance evaluation planning, and I give kudos to all of those of you who've been working on this. Some of you have completed your plans already, but you still have lots of questions about it. You're not sure if it was done correctly or how to improve it. And since it is a living document that changes over time, COVID has certainly changed some of what we had planned. And so as you begin to think about how to improve your plan, and as SRI and the TA specialists and providers work with you to evaluate what you've done already or what you're about to do, we are hoping this webinar will give you a good grounding in how to be thinking about the plan. If you're hearing things on here that you didn't do not be concerned. This is a chance for you to change direction or to make adjustments. If there's things on here that you're surprised about, please ask questions. You'll hear during Kathy's presentation, she'll talk about the different ways that you can seek TA support. So whether the plan is already done, whether you're trying to improve it, whether you need some tweaking, whatever it is you're going to need, Kathy and her colleagues will be able to assist you going forward. I just wanted to remind you that for those of you who had a plan already submitted and accepted by us, it's still going to be evaluated. It's still going to be explored for ways it could be strengthened or improved. And so that you will be hearing from Kathy and the team when they have suggestions or questions for you. So with that information, obviously there will be a chance to ask questions. This will be recorded. This is being recorded, and you will have a chance to ask questions, if not on this presentation, certainly afterwards. And so as we have in past webinars, we ask you to put your questions in the chat. And if we don't have a chance to answer them now, we certainly will be looking at them with an intent to answer them going forward. So thank you. I'm going to turn it over to Kathy, who's going to take us the rest of the way through this presentation. Thank you, Kathy.
Okay, thank you, Richard. I'm going to start my video very briefly to say hello to everyone. I have to beg forgiveness. My home internet went out over the weekend. I'm coming to you via hotspot. I don't want to press my band limit width, so I'm going to say hello, and then I'm going to just stop my video so you can keep hearing from me. I am so glad to be with you today. As Richard said, I'm Kathy Hebler. I am with SRI. I'm part of the PDG B5 TA Center, and I am an evaluator as well as a researcher, as well as an early childhood person. So this work is just really near and dear to my heart. This is being recorded. Yasmin, the recording is on, right? We're recording now, just to let everyone know. Okay, let's go on to the next slide and get started. I just wanted to give you a brief overview of what I want to try and accomplish today in the webinar. We're going to provide an overview of some of the key components of the program performance evaluation plan, and also describe some of the challenges and maybe some possible solutions to developing a high quality plan, and equally important, implementing a high quality evaluation. So I'm going to kind of jump back and forth between the plan and the evaluation. The plan is obviously what you intend to do, and the evaluation is the carrying out of what you intend to do. But they're very closely related. The thing that is so important is that the goal here is that each and every one of you have a high quality evaluation. We want it to be rigorous, we want it to be methodologically sound, but every bit as important is that it be useful to your state. And so that's one of the things that is really key. It is a grant requirement, but we are hoping that you don't just see it as a box that has to be checked off. We want it to be valuable to you. We want it to be about learning. You are doing tremendously important work, and we want to do what we can to help you do work that allows you to learn from what you're doing. It has really just been a privilege to read about what you are doing. I have read every one of the plans that are in, and there's some really exciting things that you are planning with your evaluation. I want to talk briefly about what I'm not going to do. I'm not going to teach you how to do a program performance evaluation plan in 45 minutes. That just, I don't think, can be done. I know some of you are skilled evaluators out there. You could be doing this webinar. I know others of you are relatively new to your position, and you're still trying to get a handle on all the things that are flying around you in this wonderful thing called PDG B5. So what I'm hoping is that today's content is meaningful at some level to each of you. But as Richard said, I want to emphasize, this is only the beginning. I mean, we are here for you as TA providers to give you a lot more support in this area. So I'm hoping you get something important and useful out of today, but remember, it's only the beginning. I want to start with a poll to give us just some little information about who's on the line. I see there are 84 of us. Yasmin, if you could bring up the poll. Okay, so this is the Who Are You poll. So if you could pick just one, what best describes your role? State partners are the non-state organizations, but the organizations that are working with the state. Okay, we're up to 75% of you. That's great. Get a few more in here. Okay, Yasmin, it looks like we've slowed down. If you want to close the poll, we'll share the results. Can each of you see the results?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, great. All right. So it looks like we've got a lot of state staff. Terrific. Welcome. We've got a few partners who are working on the evaluation. We've got some other partners and a little bit of mix of federal and national TA staff. So that is great. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. Okay, this in a tiny little nutshell is what is program performance evaluation. It's an ongoing assessment of your progress toward your goals and your strategic plan. And the point of it is, as I said and will keep saying, is to provide you with information to support continuous quality improvement. The simplest representation of your plan is we're doing some things and we're hoping to achieve some things. And your evaluation asks questions about those kinds of things. All right, next slide. This is the question version of what is addressed by a program performance evaluation and what is addressed by your plan. And it's variations, your questions are variations on to what extent did we carry out the activities that we intended to carry out, and then to what extent did our activities accomplish what we intended them to accomplish. And we know that ultimately everyone is doing all of this to make a difference for children and families. So that's kind of the final end of the line, end of the chain question is, did this make a difference? Next slide. Some of the concepts you're going to hear me come back to again and again are alignment, that it's useful to your state, that it drives improvement, that it is a living document, and that it is sustainable. I want to talk just a little bit about the alignment. That is a very strong theme, and you've seen it in your FOA. You've seen it You've heard Richard say it, I'm sure, in national webinars. The notion that your strategic plan is aligned with your vision and your needs assessment. So that's one kind of alignment. And then the second piece, the one I'm talking about today, is that your evaluation plan is aligned with your strategic plan. And we're going to talk some more about, and there's alignment within your evaluation plan. And that's a theme I'm going to be hitting pretty heavily today. But you're going to see all of these concepts come up again and again. Okay, next slide. Some of the things I'm going to be talking about are some of the requirements, and these are pieces. You know, what do you have to have in it? You have to have questions, aims / objectives. As I just said, these have to align with your strategic plan and your overall goals. Some people prefer to use evaluation questions. Some people prefer to use evaluation objectives. There's not a lot of difference. It's just you need a starting point that says, here is what we are looking at, and that's that first bullet. You need a logic model, and I'm going to talk a fair amount about logic models today because they are so very important to driving your work. You need to talk about inputs, activities, outputs, short-term and long-term outcomes. We're going to talk about them. You need indicators. You need data sources. Without data sources, you don't have any data. Two very different kinds of data sources for you are new data. And with new data, you get challenges around how to collect that data, how to manage that data, or using existing data. Both of these are data source options for you. You're collecting a lot of data. Efficiency would speak to the need to maximize the use of the data you are already collecting. We're going to talk to that. We're going to talk a little bit about analysis and reporting, and ultimately you need to use findings for continuous improvement. Other than stressing that that's an important theme, we're not going to really talk about how to do that because you don't have findings yet for the most part. Okay, next slide. Okay, I mentioned logic models. Logic models come in all shapes, sizes, colors. I went to Google Images and went to get pictures of logic models, and it's overwhelming how many variations there are on logic models. But ultimately, they are all the same thing. They are graphics that show how, call it a program, call it initiative, call it a strategy, call it an activity. Logic models show how you are going to bring about change. It shows the logical relationship between what you're investing, what you are doing, what you are expecting to get short term, what you are expecting to get intermediate, and what you are expecting to get long term. You'll always see them referenced, or you'll often see them referenced in the context of evaluation planning, but they are absolutely critical to program planning. So hopefully, whether you graphed it out or not, drew out the little boxes, while you were doing your strategic plan, hopefully you were thinking along the lines of a logic model, because what they are is hypotheses about what you are doing. That if we do this, we are going to get that. And when we get that, something else is going to happen. And that's what you are all engaged in. This PDG B5 effort is an experiment in systems building. You've identified your issues that you need to work on in your state with your needs system. And then you made hypotheses in the form of strategies that you're going to put in place to address those needs. But they are just that. They're really hypotheses about how your systems work and what they need to make it better. Okay, next slide. One of the things that I've seen in a lot of the PDG documents are logic models that look something akin to this, where you have 4 boxes or more boxes, but at least these 4. And in box 1 on the left, you have a very long list of activities that are being undertaken. And then you have a very long list of outputs, followed by a long list of short-term, long-term, maybe intermediate outcomes. One of the problems with this presentation is it really isn't a logic model. And I understand page limits in proposals because I have often been reduced or had to write logic models that look like this because that's all the pages you get. But this really isn't very helpful from either a program planning or an evaluation planning standpoint. And let me tell you why. Next slide. It's because you can't see the logic. What is really going on here is that activity 1 leads to outputs 1 and 2, which leads to short-term outcome 2, which leads to long-term outcomes 2, 3, 4. And then each activity leads to some other variation on the theme. So what can we do about this problem to make a more meaningful presentation? Next slide. To talk about what you can do with it, I want to do just a little bit of a diversion into some basic concepts around systems change and how we graph out systems change. One of the things that plagues us, and I don't think early childhood is unique to this, but one of the things that we have going on that impedes really clear communication is using same words to mean multiple things. So when I say to you state system, what do you think of? There are two very different ways of thinking about state system. They're neither wrong nor right, but they really do have different implications, particularly for a logic model. Let's look at the one on the left. So one way of talking about your state system is your state infrastructure. This is what's going on at your state agencies, your collaborative partners, how you are trying to bring agencies together to work together for young children and their families, new policies you're putting in place, new governance structures, you're moving agencies, you're consolidating, you're splitting. All of that goes on at the state agency, your MOUs, your new credentials. So those are state level functions that are extremely important, but they're very distal from children and families. So the implication for the logic model is that the pathway to get from your ESIDS to child change is a rather long pathway with a lot of boxes in between. And when I go boxes, I mean logic model. What has to happen for your governance structure to make a difference? Well, presumably what you're assuming with your governance structure is you get more efficient governance, and that leads to something, and that leads to something. Let's look at the right side. The right side is also a way of talking about state systems. That's state systems of services and programs. This is where we're talking about more infant-toddler care, more programs participating in your QRIS, more home visiting, more developmental screening, much, much closer to children and families. So this is really the close on and where you can get your change in child and family outcomes. Next screen, next slide, please. Okay, this is another representation that starts to come a little closer to actually looking like logic in a logic model. I want to work backwards from the right side. This is the improved outcomes. And I know from the reading and your plans, you're working on a lot of different kinds of outcomes for children and families. How do we get that? We get that through some kind of program and services. We've got long lists of programs and services that are in states and that you're working to improve. Behind that, there's certainly some kind of local infrastructure. You've got school districts that are administering state pre-K. You've got regional collaboratives that are bringing local agencies together to talk to one another. You could be working on coordinated enrollment, your resource and referral agencies. And then behind that, you've got a state infrastructure that also is carrying out some really important functions. This diagram goes a little closer to kind of getting at some of the distance between state infrastructure and improved outcomes. And I certainly did want to acknowledge that states sometimes do direct services, that they run the warm lines or they produce resources for families. They have websites and information. So there are some state services that actually go directly to children and families. One of the things to keep in mind in terms of the state structure, policy is an incredibly powerful lever for systems change. So the state has the power to reach many children, but indirectly. where the direct services have the power to make very immediate changes for children and family, but they're all over the state. So you've got an enormous task in terms of getting all of them in place, getting all of them high quality, getting all of them known. So it's a very different kind of work depending on which level, going back to the logic model, and what kind of services. Next slide. Okay, so this is a really very simplistic version of a logic model that works back from state infrastructure. Let's say you're doing something about credentialing. Well, you've got a new early childhood credential, and you are assuming that is going to do something, like lots of universities will be instituting it, or your community colleges will be putting it in place, or whatever. Something has to happen after that new credential is created. And then you've got to have students that go through the program. And then eventually those students get to programs and services, and presumably the intended outcome would be that improves quality and that improves outcomes for children and families. But the logic of that credential is its own logic, and that's the logic model that I want to advocate with you for each of your strategies of thinking about how it works and what has to happen. There's no right or wrong number of boxes between where you start and where you end up. And that's one of the problems with picking up some of the logic model templates, is you only get to put in 2. Well, you may need 4 in terms of figuring out what happens next and what happens next for you to be able to get to improved outcomes. Okay, next slide. This is an example that some of you have seen if you were on the collab call we did a few weeks ago on PPEP. This is a very simple example. This is a logic model. This one is for transition. The example is implement a pilot program in 6 states. The hypothesis is that will result in sharing of information between preschool and kindergarten. And then the next hypothesis is, and that will result in improved transitions to kindergarten for participating children and families. I give you this example with the message that you need a different logic model for each of your major activity areas, groups, clusters. You really need to think it out separately if you want the logic to work for you. And you can have as many boxes as you need to get from where you start with your activity to where you end up with your long-term outcome. Next slide. Okay, so here's the bottom line. You need multiple logic models to display the logic, and the logic model becomes important because it guides the evaluation. It guides what kind of data you're going to collect. Many of them will have different outputs. They'll have different short and intermediate outcomes. You may have some of them that share some of the outcomes, and you may have different or same long-term outcomes. But I would encourage you to think about your activities separately and to develop logic models for each of them. They're so important because if you do a good job on your logic model, it is such a strong foundation on which to build your evaluation. If you don't do a good job on your logic model, then it becomes really hard to lay out your plan for your evaluation. Next slide. Of course, what do you have now? You have 10, 12, or 15 logic models. And you have the Humpty Dumpty challenge, which is how do you put it all together again in a way that makes sense? This is challenging, but this is the world of systems change. Systems are complex things. And so we need to deal with the pieces and we need to deal with the whole. And we go back and forth, deal with the pieces, deal with the whole. At some point, you need to put it together and step back and see the whole. And we're going to talk some more about how to do that. Next slide. Okay, I mentioned earlier, we have a tendency to use the same word to mean multiple things. One of those words that can mean multiple things is activity. What's an activity? For our purposes, we're going to define an activity as what your state puts in place, carries out, implements to achieve a goal or a long-term outcome. It's something that either an entity or a person does, and then by definition can fail to do. It's really important to be able to articulate your activities because you have to report on them, your progress on your activities in your annual performance report. One of the things I noticed in reading the program performance evaluation plans that I read is I couldn't tell from some of them what the activities were that the state is carrying out. And that's probably not a good sign. Your plan should make very clear what activities you have in place because you need to be able to answer that question. To what extent did we carry out our activities as planned? Okay, next slide. Okay, I want you to read each of these. You can pick up a pencil or not pick up a pencil. But as you read them, which ones of them feel to you like they are activities? They can all be called activities, but some of them I would maintain are actually closer to goals and really don't answer the question, what did we do? So let's just kind of go through them one at a time. Maximizing parent and family knowledge, choice, and engagement concerning their child's early learning and development. Terrifically important, but that's not really an activity. That's more of a goal or a long-term outcome. Facilitate coordination between school system and local community-based programs. That's starting to feel a little closer to an activity to me, but I'm still not sure exactly what is happening here. I think that is what you want to happen as an outcome of doing something, but it doesn't really say what is being done. Conduct outreach to potential partners. That's getting closer in my frame for talking about something you're doing. Provide coaching and professional development. I got that. I understand what you're doing. Analyze current funding allocations and expenditures and assess alignment with strategic plan priorities. I can get that. Develop and implement a pre-service apprenticeship model. That feels like an activity to me. So as you look in your plan, look over what you have written as activities and see if you can really speak to the did we do it question. One of the ways to think about it is if you're asking the did we achieve this, it's probably a goal or an outcome. If it answers a did we do it, it's probably much closer to an activity. Okay, next slide. Another important concept in logic models, I will say important in the sense that you will always see it addressed in logic model literature, is this outputs versus outcomes. I'm not going to read all of these. I'm going to go pretty quickly through them so we have enough time to cover some of the rest of this. What are outputs? They're the immediate and direct result of program activities. So it's a count of services, it's a count of products. It leads to the outcome, but it's not the outcome. That's why I bolded that. That's the key concept there. If that is all you do, you have not done enough because that's never the end of the chain. If it's not the end of the chain, it's still an output. It's not an outcome. Examples: numbers of training provided, number of home visits provided, number of teachers who attend the training. Those are all outputs. Outcomes are changes in systems or people that are to be achieved. Those are changes in your state infrastructure, changes in the quality of your service, changes in access, child or family skills and capacities. And so you can see some of the examples. Ultimately, whether you call it an output or an outcome doesn't matter that much. That's not really the point. The critical point is, do I need to be talking about what it leads to? If I still have to go somewhere and say it's something else. Now, and that's not to say short-term outcomes actually lead to intermediate outcomes, lead to longer-term outcomes. But outputs for sure always have something behind them. But like I said, ultimately, if you label it wrong in the logic model, nothing happens, absolutely nothing, because the logic model will still work for you. Okay, next slide. Let's talk real briefly, quickly about indicators. Indicators are your evidence. They are the evidence for the output or the outcome. They almost always begin with number of or percent of. There is a little acronym for the CREAM, for good indicators. To me, I think it's the first three that are absolutely critical. Your indicator has to be clear. It has to be precise and unambiguous. It has to be relevant, also known as aligned. It has to be appropriate to the output or outcome. It has to be economic in the sense that you can do it at a reasonable cost. One of the things I want to say here, and I'll say it again, this evaluation is for you. So figure out how to use your resources wisely. Do not pay more for data than you need to pay, because ultimately it is all about getting something that is useful to you. Next slide. Some examples of indicators. Notice I said they usually begin with numbers or percent. Number and type of participating program, number and demographics of families receiving services, number of MOUs. Field 2, given what I said earlier about systems, these are at very different levels, but they're all indicators. Percent of blended, braided, and layered funding, number of individuals on wait lists, number of referrals, number of children with screens. All of those are a percent of children with screens. All of those are examples of indicators. Okay, let me go on to the next slide. This is the alignment issue. So your indicator has to align with the outcome that it is meant to be part of. So if you have written an outcome that says stakeholders will have access to community resource maps, I wish I could be with you in a room because I'd really like to do kind of lots of question and answer around these, but kind of go with me here and pretend we're all together and pretend we have enough time that I'd actually blanked out the other column. So if you have an outcome that says stakeholders have access to community resources, what would feel like a good indicator? Does the existence of community resource maps really align with that outcome? I would maintain that it doesn't. What would be a better, and again, if I had you in the room, we'd be calling and having some discussion about that. I would much rather see an indicator that says something like percent of stakeholders who indicate they have access to community resource maps. That aligns with the outcome. And when I say align, I mean, these are both on the same content topic, so it's not like it's all that different, but it's just not quite on target. Involvement of partners has been formalized, an indicator, number of MOUs developed. Seems reasonable to me. I would buy that as evidence that partners' involvement has been formalized. This next one's kind of tricky. Service providers deliver programs with fidelity and quality.
Did we lose you, Kathy?
Yeah, I think we might have this her. We can give him a couple minutes just so. She's speaking to her phone, so we probably let's just give some time here.
Well, she warned us all that she was in a hot spot. Hopefully she could get back on in a moment or two. So there was a question wanting to know what is the connection between the program performance evaluation plan and the federal reporting that is required. And I think the answer to that is actually very similar to what Kathy was just talking about. The program performance evaluation plan, although it's a requirement for you to submit it to us, basically the evaluation is for you. So we don't really, I mean, the outcomes you select, the indicators you identify, it's what's important to the state to know and what's going to move you farther along in your goals and objectives. The federal reporting is really for us at the federal level, right? I mean, hopefully it's helpful to you, but it allows us to begin to look at not only what were the outcomes that you've accomplished? What were the successes you had? It allows us to talk to Congress. It allows us to talk to other legislators and leadership. It allows us to basically analyze, even look across grantees to see what's common, what's similar, what's different. So it really helps us. They're both requirements of the grant, but one was totally intended for you, which is why basically when you submit to us, those of you who have already submitted your plan, you'll notice we accepted the plan, but we didn't evaluate the plan. We basically said, does it have all of the elements we asked you to include in a plan? And if it did, we accepted the plan. What Kathy and her team is going to be doing next is looking at that plan, following what she's talking about in this presentation, and she's going to be able to basically look at the plan and point out some of the things that you'll probably be able to see for yourself as you're going through this presentation with her, where you might need additional support or additional TA to help you do a better job, or to focus in an area that you might have not really developed as well as you now would think that you would want to. So hopefully these two things, those are really the differences between the two. They're both important, but they're important in different ways. So when it comes to the PPEP, you will not necessarily, this is the second question, you will not need to submit a report to us, but you will in your initial, in your final report for the grant in the initial year and each following year, you will be giving us an update on what you're learning. So it is very possible that while you're not giving us a PPEP report, you will be telling us about the extent to which your evaluation has uncovered or assisted you in moving farther along and achieving your outcomes. So I hope that helps, and we can discuss it more a little bit later. Kathy, I think you might be on again. If you are, I'm going to pass this over to you. Although you still have a mute button on, so maybe not.
Me?
Kathy? Yep, go ahead.
Can you hear?
Yep, now we can.
Oh, good. Okay.
So you were in the middle, you were just talking about the issue of whether or not dosage and duration is an indicator. You were just about to address that issue.
Thank you. All right. I don't know what happened there, and I didn't realize I was gone, so I'm going to back up. I'm going to, in the interest of time, I'm just going to kind of skim through these really quickly and tell you that the last three have some issues with alignment. Delivering programs with fidelity is rarely measured by dosage and duration. Best practices, service providers use best practices is not the same thing as having knowledge of best practices, and families being satisfied is not the same thing as how often they have been to the.
We lost you again, Kathy. Oh no. Okay. Let me think a minute. I could do this presentation, but I would be doing it much less effectively than she did. I hope someone else is communicating with her again. And let me see.
Okay, I'm not sure exactly what's going on. I saw Faith's message. I actually am calling in with my phone. I'm not on Zoom, so it's my phone that is actually bouncing me out. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can. Go ahead, Faith. Go ahead, Kathy.
All right. Let's get brave and go on to the next slide. Okay, you have options with your data sources. And some of those options are use of your existing administrative data. States and localities collect a lot of data anyway. Try to make use of that data in your evaluation. You also have the option to do 1, 2, 3 time data collections, focus groups, surveys, interviews, classroom observations. Classroom observations may actually be part of your ongoing data as part of your QRIS, in which case switch that bullet over to the first column because it's something you can make use of on a regular basis. Focus group surveys, interviews, these are all wonderful techniques, but they're resource intensive. And generally, they're time limited. You may not have the resources to continue to do these things. So it's hard for them to be sustainable in the sense of informing your systems change work into the future. But again, there may be times when you want to use them, but they are more resource intensive, and they may not be something that you can do into the future. And then you have things like data collections that are repeated data collections, like market rate surveys that you're doing repeatedly anyway. Again, message, choose sustainability whenever you can. Next slide. Okay, I mentioned the importance of your individual logic models. If you lay out your logic, then you can lay out your questions literally right under your boxes. Get yourself some of those yellow sticky papers and put them all over. And then you can see what you've got and what you should be asking. And under your questions, you can then talk about the evidence, the indicator that aligns with that question. And then you can talk about the data source that aligns with that particular piece of evidence or indicator. So the value beauty in those logic models is that it allows you to lay all this out in a very nice, tight little package in terms of making sure that you are collecting or have the kind of data that you need to get to your indicators. Okay, next slide. In the interest of time, I'm not going to run through this the way I had planned to. But one of the things I want you to think about is just kind of look at that list on the left and think about where's your data source on the right for how you would get at these kinds of things. Some are easier to get at than others. And the thing I want you to think about is you don't have to go overboard on your data collection. Next slide, please. So for example, here's a completed table with where you might get some of this data from. The one that, if you're not already doing classroom observation, I can tell you that the fidelity measurement in classroom observation is extremely resource intense. That is going to cost you a whole lot more than doing a family survey, which will cost you more than getting existing state data that you already have. That's one of the things you need to be considering as you are thinking about your data sources. Next slide. Again, maximize use of data. When you have a choice, use your resources that allow you, the box in the corner, to build your state capacity. So be intentional about opting for those new one-time data collections. The other important piece is don't collect more evidence or more complicated evidence than you need. The evidence for some things is really pretty straightforward. Use that reasonable person test. What kind of evidence does a reasonable person need to believe that we have done this? You don't need to measure everything, even though you can lay out all those little yellow sticky boxes under each of your outcomes and your questions. That doesn't mean you have to collect it all. That's where you need to make your judicious choices about what is going to net us the most in the long run. It is okay to say we are choosing not to collect data on this because we're going to collect data on something else, because you can't possibly collect data on everything if you play it all out. Okay, so what do we do? Next slide. Addressing complexity. You've got multiple goals, multiple activities, multiple indicators, multiple data collection strategies. Oh my, what are you going to do? You need to break it into digestible pieces. Don't collect more data than you need. KISS principle absolutely applies here. And you want to be able to communicate what you're doing to your stakeholders. If you make it so complicated no one can understand it, you will never be able to get good stakeholder involvement. So you have to keep it, you know, and you may do things with regard to communication. You may do more than you choose to communicate too. Some things you may collect for internal purposes just because you want to know them. And some things you really want to report out on because it's the bigger, more important picture. Next slide. The 3-bear solution here. Try to get it just right. Hit that note that is not too much data, but not enough data. Answer the really important questions, but don't answer every possible question you could have. Next slide. This is the how much evidence is needed question. And again, reasonable person. If your activity is to produce a cross-state systems plan, your evidence is the completed plan. That's it. It's not rocket science. It's not complicated. That's all you need. If your activity is to convene a statewide advisory group, document the dates on which you convene the group. You can also have number and type of stakeholders. You can have the minutes. You can content analyze the minutes, but you don't have to. If the activity says convene the stakeholder group, provide the evidence that you convened the stakeholder group. If the activity is develop an ESIDS, what's reasonable evidence? There's all sorts of things you could do, and they're all in the box. But basically, if it were to me, I would document the date when the thing became functional. And then all that other information is really good information for you to have. You may want to collect it. But again, in the spirit of not collecting more than you need because it becomes more than you can handle, think about what is really essential for your questions. And then I want to close with one final slide here that we're not going to talk, next slide, please. I'm not going to talk too much about today. This is the issue of addressing equity and addressing equity in your questions and your analysis, particularly when we talk about improved outcomes, and that's why I put which in parentheses. Almost always we provide the same things, but we don't get the same outcomes. So you have to ask questions about which children and families are participating, which children and families are receiving services, which ones are not. Is that program really reaching its intended recipients? And the way you do that is through meaningful disaggregation. And you can disaggregate by lots of things, by race, by dual language learner status, by disability, urban, suburban, rural, areas within your state. But it always comes back to the same question. Are we getting equity in the sense of, are we getting those outcomes for everyone we want to get them for? Are your good outcomes equally distributed? And that's also, I mean, the use of data for continuous improvement cuts across the board, but particularly with the equity question, if we're not getting what we want for some of our children and families, what do we do to our strategy, our activity to get that? Okay, we do have a few minutes left, so I've got 2 poll questions for you. I want to, next slide, please. I want to go to questions to see if anyone has questions. I know there's been a little bit of chat. So we've got a few minutes for questions, and then I'm going to leave a few minutes to do some poll questions about TA. I want to say if anyone, again, the point is we are here to help you. If any of this has stimulated questions for you, areas that you want more help in, that is what we are all about. So let me look in the chat real
There's
quickly.
nothing in the chat, Kathy. Nothing in
the chat. Okay, anybody want to come off mute? Comments, questions? Should I go back to a slide and clarify anything?
Hi, this is Kristen from New York State, and I
Hi,
think
Kristen.
that, hi, I really like the way you presented the information because it feels less overwhelming when you're talking about exactly what are we going to measure. So that made me feel really good. One thing that I've been struggling with is measuring a process that involves collaboration and how I measure collaboration. So I'm wondering if you can speak to that at all.
Yeah, well, and in fact, there's a lot of literature on that because there are a lot of people struggling with that. Maybe we could, I mean, we might even want to do a little webinar on measuring collaboration and what some of the things are. And I think part of it, and Rebecca, thank you for the Wilder collaboration factors. That is a really good
yeah,
resource
thanks, Rebecca.
on collaboration. And part of it is kind of thinking through, there's the process of collaboration and then there's the outcome of collaboration. So I would encourage all of you who are thinking about collaboration that you want to think about what your process is, but we can certainly pull together some resources for you on measuring collaboration.
Great, thank you. Thanks for all the chat stuff too. That looks great.
Anyone else? Questions? Okay, well, why don't we go on to the poll and then we'll see if any questions come in. So with regard to topics for future TA, on my screen, I have to actually scroll down because we have so many options. Make sure you've looked at all of them. You can check as many as you would like, and or you can check other and write in the chat what particular topics you might be interested in. We're up to almost half of you. Okay, Yasmin, you want to close the poll and share the results? Reporting and communicating findings came out as the #1, but that's, I mean, overall, it is a pretty even spread in terms of topics that you would like help with. So that is good for us to know. There's a lot in there. Okay, and we have one final question for you. And we've got a comment from Rachel. Metrics for tracking application of equity principles. We probably want to do more, I think, on equity and using data to help get at equity issues. Yasmin, before you launch the next poll, could you advance the slide, 2 slides forward? And why I wanted Yasmin to do this is this is what you're going to see in the poll. So we wanted to get some input on preferred forms of TA, but I wanted to define some of this for you before you see the poll. We're going to ask about work groups. What is a work group? It is a facilitated small community of a small number of individuals, you folks, who will work and learn together on a common issue for a limited period of time. For example, reporting and communicating findings. It will work with an online space. It will be a peer community, but we will do things together on that topic. A workshop, on the other hand, would be a series of calls that are really focused on skill building in a particular area. It could be 2 calls, could be 5 calls, won't be 10 calls. There's probably going to be it's kind of like seminars. There'd probably be pre-work, there may be practice work, but it really is focused on skill building. Another option is office hours, where someone like me, I'm on the line, I'm available from 1 to 2 on Mondays every week, and you can just call in and talk. Individualized TA for your state or the ever-present other, please write in the chat. Okay, if you would bring the poll up, Yasmin. Okay, we're almost to half. Okay, I think we can close it. Oh, we got another vote right there. Again, we've got one that got more votes than others, but this is quite a spread. So it seems like there's a fair amount of interest in lots of different forms of TA. So that is it for what I have. I want to give one final, in our last minute, one final opportunity for questions or comments. Richard, did you want to say anything to close out?
Sure. So hopefully you found this helpful, and some piece of it, as you saw from Kathy's polls, there'll be more information being made of different ways to make that information available to you. But in the meantime, if you have a specific request, you can certainly reach out to Kathy. But the other thing you can do is reach out to your TA specialist, and you're going to be getting more information in the next few days of how to do that, and if you don't already know, so that you can put in your specific requests and get the support in the ways that you need. The last message I would just say is, folks, again, look, we're in this with you. So the PPEP, don't get so caught up in what we're requiring. The PPEP is for you. You need to make it a useful tool for you and your colleagues in your state. It has to help you advance. That's the purpose of the grant. You give us a PPE just to meet the fact that you're giving it to us. We're not going to do anything with it. So it doesn't really help us. We're just using it. We asked you for it so that we could help guide you and direct you to the expectation of something we think is valuable in helping you be successful as you do your work. Well, you'll be continuing to hear from us on our Friday networking sessions. The TA provider will be contacting you in many different ways. And we thank you for being on this webinar and all future calls and webinars. Thank you, Kathy, for putting this together. I know a lot of people had questions, and hopefully you were able to answer them. I know they probably generated a lot more questions that people will come to you with at another time. So thank you, everybody. And Kathy, thank you.
Thank you, everyone. It's been nice being with you. Look forward to more conversations.
Take care.
Bye-bye.